The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Brunner, Program Specialist for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and I thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Sex Trafficking Part 2, which will help participants understand the interconnections of sex trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and children exposed to violence. Today's presenter is Dr. Alexandra Sandi Pierce, President of Ottayoni Research. Sandi was the author of the first research report produced in the United States on sex trafficking of Native women called Shattered Hearts for the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. She's also one of the principal investigators of Mapping the Market for Sex with Trafficked Minor Girls in Minneapolis that was just released this September of 2014. Sandi will be presenting for the first hour, and we will leave a half hour for Q&A at the end of her presentation. If you have questions, please write them down so you don't forget, or you can type them into the chat box, and Sandi will answer your questions during the Q&A. So thank you, Sandi, for joining us today to help us walk through the patterns of violence against women and children. Tang Chin, Technology Director for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, will share with us how to use the webinar tools.
Hi, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. For those of you that have not attended one of our webinars in the past, I want to bring your attention to the control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen there. Within that control panel, if at any time during today's session, should you have any audio issues, there is an audio panel section that you can open up. You can within that section click on telephone and then back to mic and speakers to try to reconnect to the session to get a better audio connection. And if that continues to be an issue, just click on the telephone and there'll be a phone number and a PIN that you can enter to connect to the audio session. The visual should still be on your screen, so be sure to stay connected. And then, as Lisa had mentioned, there is a questions section within that control panel. Feel free to type in your questions at any time during today's presentation, and we'll make every effort to answer them during the process, either at the end or as we go. Any technical issues, I will respond to you back in the text form. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation.
Thank you, Tang. All right, you're on, Sandi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Sandi Pierce. I am Seneca, and I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been doing this work on violence against women and children probably since the 1970s. I am a survivor of all of the forms of violence that we're going to be talking about. And so that's where my interest came, and I got a chance to go to school, and I kept going until I earned a doctorate because I wanted to build some credibility on convincing folks that these are real issues, they're important, and they're not just stories that we tell each other. So I'm calling this Seeing the Wendigo. I don't know if I don't think everybody's tradition has this, but my mom used to tell me a story about the Wendigo. She said it was a cannibal spirit that entered people having hard times, and it caused them to devour the weak ones, the vulnerable ones among us, our children and our women. And that always stuck in my head, so I'm calling this Seeing the Wendigo. These are our goals. Let me see. Okay. There we go. Recognize the connections between various types of violence, identify the ways that experiencing and witnessing violence affect victims, and consider some interventions that address repeated exposure to violence of various types. So hopefully that's what I'll be accomplishing with you all. We all know, I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows that our Native communities have extremely high rates of all of these kinds of violence: child sexual abuse, child neglect, community violence, suicide, domestic and interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. The research is out there. We know it's true. So I'm going to look at, these are mostly research findings, and these are general research. These are not necessarily Indian specific, but they are national studies on the kinds of abuse and their effects. I'm going to be talking about them as if they're separate entities, separate kinds of violence, as if they're not connected. But as I go through, I'm going to be talking about the ways that they are connected. So what we know about child sexual abuse is that both of these kinds, sexual and physical abuse, both of these kinds of violence place child victims at high risk of very serious and chronic problems with many areas of their lives: physical health, PTSD and other mental health issues, suicidality, self-harm, cutting, eating disorders, substance abuse, sexuality, and sexual behavior. All these main areas of life are affected by both physical and sexual abuse in childhood. One thing that we're learning more in the research area is that physical abuse and neglect may actually be an even stronger predictor of early sexual activity than sexual abuse. And it's because there are psychological impacts, and they include making the child, there's an emotional hole. They make the child need attention, affection. When you develop a poor sense of self because nobody seems to care about you, and these decreased feelings of personal value. The trauma responses to these things, though, are the things that really affect kids' future lives. And those of us who are adults, we can look back and say, yep, that really did affect me in this way. These are the trauma responses. Efforts to escape the painful feelings through substance abuse, aggressive or disruptive behavior, or risk-taking. We see this in our schools, where the kids who have experienced abuse and neglect are the kids who are acting up, getting in trouble, taking risks. It's because they're trying to escape those painful feelings. We also see early sexual activity. Kids who have experienced child abuse and neglect are more likely to be involved in hookup and survival sex, unprotected sex. And they are also, this is where I really focus on my research, they're very much more vulnerable to sex traffickers who are promising love, glamour, excitement, self-sufficiency. It sounds like a way to not hurt anymore. And so the kids are really, really vulnerable to this. All right, kids who witness intimate partner violence in the home, who see usually their mother or female caregiver battered, they are also at high risk for severe lifelong problems. It's the same pattern: physical and mental health, school and peer relationships, disruptive behavior. And the one that really hit me hard is 49 to 70% of cases in a national study of children who had witnessed intimate partner violence in the home were also either physically or sexually abused by the batterer. So not only is the person being battered sustaining harm, by witnessing the child sustains harm, and they also are sustaining physical and sexual harm themselves. So now I'm looking at the connection of abuse and neglect and sex trafficking. This is a study that was in Milwaukee, and they looked at 77 sex trafficked youth, and that's using the federal definition, which means they were trafficked into the sex trade by force, fraud, coercion, and they were under 18. So this was ages 12 to 17. Almost a third of them were 15 or younger. 40% had a child or juvenile in need of protection case on record. They were already in government records as a CHIPS case. And 69% of them had already been reported as missing at least once. Now, in the Mapping the Market study that I just did, we looked at the operations of sex trafficking organizations that were focusing on juveniles. And in that one, we found that 55% of the kids who had been sex trafficked had already been reported as missing, runaway, or truant. So unprotected children really show up on this list of sex trafficked youth. Witnessing community violence is another area of study. Children exposed to community violence in their neighborhoods and schools. This is not necessarily in their homes. They often see their family members, peers, trusted adults, and strangers injured or even murdered. And the people involved in this may be innocent bystanders, the people who mean something to the kids, or they might be active participants. But what happens with the kids is they come to view violence as a normal part of daily life. I know that when I started bringing this information together, it was like, well, yeah, check. That's true in my community. Yep. To see it all come together and to realize that kids are exposed to kids, and I talk about kids mostly because this is what sets the pattern. And the victimization continues into adulthood. And poly-victimization is the term that they use in the research literature. It means toxic exposure to multiple kinds of violence. Family violence, child physical sexual abuse, community violence, lateral violence. But looking at these as separate issues is not helpful. If we're going to work with people exposed to many kinds of violence over the course of their lifetimes, it's not useful to only focus on one kind of violence. So here are the effects of poly-victimization, and these again are national studies. The kids who are victims of multiple kinds of violence have at least double the risk and severity of post-traumatic effects and health and mental disorders, up to 10 times the risk. It's at least double. And they also, and this is what I think really hits the children in our communities, they are at very high risk of losing the basic capacity for normal development. And it really stops them or gets in the way of them becoming successful learners and productive, healthy adults. So it has long-term consequences. And this is one of those long-term consequences. I apologize for the bottom line. The Macintosh system did not like the font that I have in the name of my company, so it changed it. So we can't read the bottom. But if we look at Native youth in the juvenile justice system, this is the most recent report I could find. From 1999 to 2008, up to 60% of the juveniles in federal custody were Native kids. And part of why this is important is if a reservation doesn't have a juvenile detention center or a juvenile justice program, the kids are sent to facilities very far from home, and if it's a serious felony, they can be sent to a federal prison or facility, and that increases the harms done to them. On top of the trauma they'd experienced that got them in this position, we do more damage by incarcerating them in a system that does not protect them and does not help them. If we look at the violence in tribal communities, we see crime rates that are more than 2.5 times the national rate. And on some reservations, it's more than 20 times the national rate. The child abuse and neglect rates are significantly higher than the national rates. And as of 2014, over 8,000 Native children were in foster care placement. That is a lot of kids. This is a study that was done in 2010, and it's based on Indian Health Service data. More than 7,000 reported abused and neglected American Indian and Alaska Native children. Now, these are the only ones that are reported, and I chose the states with the highest rates. If you look at the first column, it's the percent of victims. In Alaska, Native youth were 48.5% of all the state's victims. They only represent 17% of the state's child population. South Dakota, we have 46.8% of the victims are Native kids, but they only represent 13% of the population. So it's very disproportionate. We know that the rates are high. Montana has about double. Minnesota is about 6 times their rate in the population, and Nebraska is about 4 times the rate in the population. All right, if we look into Alaska, I found a report from Covenant House in Alaska. They specialize in working with runaway and homeless youth. Almost all of the youth coming to the Anchorage, Alaska Covenant House from the rural areas were Alaska Native. And the proportion of youth that they serve in Anchorage has almost doubled for Native youth over the prior 10 years. It was 20% in 1999. It's nearly 40% in 2010. So in a 10-year period, it jumped double. We have more and more kids seeking help because home is not a safe or rewarding place. I know it's bad news. It really is bad news. And so I'm making the point that it's bad news. But if we look at the environmental effects, these are from Minnesota. This is where I do most of my research. And in 2 of the studies I've done, we found that high rates of neighborhood and community poverty, crime and violence are linked to increased rates of sexual violence against teen girls, increased rates of girls victimized by teen dating violence, and increased exposure to sex traffickers and normalization of commercial sex. The kids look around, they see active and visible prostitution, they see pimps in their daily lives, they're part of the neighborhood, and it normalizes sexual exploitation. So I didn't start off with boarding schools because we're all really familiar with this, with the effects of the boarding schools. But when we looked at it in relation to violence, and we look at it as a kind of trauma, losing one's language, culture, and family and community were hugely traumatic for the children. And in that setting, that trauma was framed as their own fault because they were hanging on to something that was useless. Once the kids came back home, most of them did not fit into their communities, and they were isolated from community supports. They hadn't been there, they didn't fit into the social world, and that isolation caused additional trauma. So what we know about trauma response is that sometimes people adapt to dysfunctional coping strategies. What is most important is as the children were taught that individualism was right and rejection of being respectful and responsible to your community was knocked down. And so we had cultural constraints against harming each other, and they have broken down a little more with every generation. So we are, in many ways, on a downswing, but at the same time, we have incredible efforts to reclaim language, reclaim culture, and tribes are doing amazing stuff to protect the kids, but it's an upstream fight. Lateral violence is the one we talk about very seldom, but especially with adolescents, it has an extra damaging effect on normal adolescent development. We also see it carry into adulthood, and it fractures our community relationships. Gossip and lies, verbal aggression, name-calling, bullying, social exclusion, isolation, the you're not Indian enough kind of stuff. We saw that in play on Red Lake when the one child killed other children. When a child is locked out and told they don't belong and they've already been traumatized, turning to violence is not an unusual response. But what we need to recognize is that these lateral violence are not part of normal child development. Kids picking on each other is not part of normal child development, but they are behaviors that were learned in the boarding schools. And if we recognize them as such, we have the opportunity to counter how often it happens. All right? So we have all this bad news, all these kinds of violence, and every one of them results in trauma. So what do we know about trauma? It happens when people experience events or situations that overwhelm their ability to cope. It can become chronic if it never stops happening. It occurs when it's an experience that threatens a person's life, safety, or well-being. Well, when that threat is constant, you have chronic trauma. And childhood trauma has long-range impacts. Trauma that continues to happen over the lifetime has tremendous impacts. This is the immediate effect of trauma: intense feelings of fear, terror, helplessness, hopelessness. And the longer term are PTSD, which we have very, very high rates in our communities. But part of PTSD and part of trauma response is a desire to escape those feelings. And some of the most dysfunctional coping strategies we see that actually contribute to child abuse and neglect are a desire to escape those feelings. It's feeling that overwhelmed that you can't stand it anymore. So if we look at the effects of chronic trauma on parents and caregivers, adversity, there's research that has shown hugely that life adversity can cause strain on caregivers, and that caregivers can try to escape the painful emotions, just as I said earlier, by using dysfunctional coping strategies. That can be substance abuse. It can be checking out emotionally. It can be distancing yourself from your children, not spending time with your children, leaving them with other people. And it should not be surprising that violence is a trauma response. It isn't just something that causes trauma. It is a response to being traumatized to try to keep the pain away. So in our communities, we see in caregivers and our community members unhealed generational trauma, violence as a learned behavior, which came straight out of the boarding schools. And I know I grew up in a family that violence was seen as an appropriate way to teach a child a lesson that they would not forget. The problem is the lesson that was taught was that violence is a way to get what you want or what you feel you need. Every generation, we've added new layers of grief and loss and trauma, and the dysfunctional coping strategies have grown. And one of those it's in parenting, but one of the really serious dysfunctional coping strategies is turning off your red flags. And it is no longer trusting your ability to recognize a dangerous person, a dangerous situation, a setup that is exploitative, where you will be exploited or used. Those signals get turned off. And when they get turned off, children learn to turn theirs off too. And that was very common in my family. My mom turned off all of her warning signs. I grew up having none. And I ended up being grabbed by a pimp as a first husband, I used to make a joke and say I had a target painted on my forehead. And it really felt that way. It's because I simply could not see the red flags. So what we know about violence is that it creates trauma, but it's also a trauma response. I want to look at just Minneapolis. This is all theory, it's all other research, but I want to talk about how this affects the Native community just in the area where I live. And my research partner and I at the University of Minnesota are going to be expanding the Mapping the Market project that Lisa mentioned, where we look at sex trafficking operations and how they function. So Minneapolis is where I do most of my work. We're going to be going throughout the state in the next 2 years and learning more in other cities. Now, these data are not brand new. They're 2010. This was what I could find. This is the Families in Poverty in Hennepin County, which is the site of Minneapolis. It is, I think it's the largest county in the state population-wise. The dark bar is families in general, all families. The light bar is the different racial groups. If you look at American Indian, almost 42% of these are single mother-headed households. 42% of American Indians live in poverty by the federal standard. Now that's in the city where there are state programs, county programs that can help. But that's off the chart. That's higher than any of the immigrant and refugee groups. It's higher than African Americans. And we also have a couple tribes that have decent casinos. So this is still 42% of the people are raising their children in serious poverty. The next 3 slides, I've worked with Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center for 10 years, and they have a set of programs called Sacred Journey programs. They are drop-in programs. They are education, crafts, times to hang out together. It's safe space. Most of the women and kids who come to these programs are not court ordered, are not ordered by child protection. I have 2 age groups here. The one in the middle column is 18 to 62. That's Healing Journey is the older women, and Oshkonegiquay is the younger women. That's not 18 to 62. It's 22 to 62. I have a typo. So that's good to know. I have to go forward. There I am. Sorry for the whiplash. It's really 22 to 62 in the first column. And then 12 to 21 is Oshkonegiquay, which is young women. It is the traumatic experiences scale. And we do a really comprehensive intake, but we also administer this scale, and it is done as an interview. It's not done, here's a form, fill it out. It's done as an interview. So the traumatic events listed, I chose the ones that seem to have the most impact. But look at the younger girls. 87% had already been exposed to someone using a weapon to rob or try to rob either them or one of their family members in their presence. 65% saw someone in their neighborhood beaten up, shot, or killed. Over half saw or heard a family member being hit, punched, kicked very hard, or killed. But if you look at the older women, you see the rates go up in the exposure to community violence, but the weapon is lower. So the use of weapons to rob somebody is really much higher now than it was with the older women. All right, that was exposure to violence. This is parental absence, also part of the scale. Separated from parents for a long time, foster care, or never seeing them again. Almost 90% of the older women had that traumatic event, but 3/4 of the younger women had that traumatic event. Had time in life living in a car shelter on the street. Almost all of the older women had that happen. And the younger ones, 65%. Over 60% for a family member depressed or mentally ill for a long time, or a family member put in jail or prison and taken away by police. that kind of instability for somebody to protect and care for them and keep them safe, that kind of absence is hugely traumatic, and it sets them up for later problems. All right, absence of safety. Again, really high rates for the 12 to 21 age group. Living with an older, stronger person who abused alcohol or street drugs, someone in the home was physically violent, threatened or picked on by a non-family member, and made to touch private sexual parts. 25% said yes. And this, remember, this is at intake. They've just met this intake worker, the one who will be their case manager. They've just met this person. So that 26%, I think, is an undercount for the sexual abuse. And then traumatic loss. A family member or person close to them died unexpectedly. Over half of the 12 to 21-year-olds had already had that happen. Having a parent swear at, put down, say hurtful things like, "I wish you'd never been born, get out of here, I never want to see you again, you make me sick," that sort of thing. Over 40% of the 12 to 21-year-olds. And then somebody in her home tried to hurt or kill themselves. All of these, again, I'll say, these are not people who were mandated to a treatment program. These are people who are in a drop-in program. They're not there because somebody sent them there because they have problems. And this is their daily lives. All right. We also screen for sexual exploitation risk, and that is part of the intake. So we had, this is ages 12 to 21, and this is over an 18-month period. 34% had already traded sex to get something they needed. 26 were sexually trafficked as children. Over 40% had one or more friends in prostitution at that time, and almost a third knew at least one pimp personally. Now that is their social circle in their neighborhood. Regular contact with gang members was 45%. The average age of these young women was 16, but the average age of those that first were involved in commercial sex was less than 11 years old. So this is a community environment, a home environment that is extremely dangerous, extremely traumatic. And this is just with 2 small programs at an urban Indian organization. A lot of the kids that come to them, the young ones, have run away from up north, one of the reservations up north, or their families are from up north and are very unsettled. There's a lot of movement back and forth to the reservation, to the city. All right. Oh, it jumped ahead. So we've looked at the kinds of violence. We've looked at the traumatic impact. There is a body of research that really interests me, and instead of just looking at the victims and looking at their characteristics, there are some folks who study the people, the perpetrators, and who they target. And that's part of the sex trafficking research I did. It's absolutely part of research on violence against women and children. But there's one body of research that focuses on victim selection. Remember I said that I felt like I had a target painted on my forehead? Well, I was selected as a victim. So what do perpetrators look for? First of all, there are lifestyles and daily routines, environments that can create a context that expose the potential victim to dangerous places and people. That's pretty clear from the women and girls at Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center's programs. Exactly that. Their environment around them is a context that exposes them to things that will hurt them. Perpetrators target individuals that they view as attractive or valuable in some way. Sex traffickers look for the kids who are fresh, who are unprotected, who are young, and so they're looking for what they can use. But they also consider perpetrators of all kinds look at the victim's access to what they call capable guardianship. I know it sounds like child protection language, but it means that somebody looking out for that young person, somebody looking out for that victim, where the penalties are going to be higher than the perpetrator wants to take a chance on. So it isn't like anybody out there can be a victim, but the most likely victim is the one that doesn't have protection. Now, this is what I was a little bit talking about, the targeting of Native adolescents. This is out of Shattered Hearts and Mapping the Market. This is what sex traffickers look for in Native youth. They look for the ones who are exotic. They love mixed blood kids. And it'll be multiracial of every kind, but they consider them exotic. They're fresh because they're young. They're unprotected. They look for the ones whose basic needs are not being met, meaning housing, food, warmth, clothing. They look for kids who are traumatized, the kids who don't see the red flags. People who are trying to talk about them negatively would say that these kids are gullible. In fact, they have blinders on because they've never been taught to recognize that there are dangerous and exploitative people who will harm them, so they don't know how to see them. They look for kids who have cognitive delays. FASD is a big one. They really seek out adolescents with FASD or that have depression, anxiety, mental illness kind of thing. Bipolar kids show up in sex trafficking cases all the time. And they look for the kids who are emotionally insecure, that are so starved for positive attention that they will fall for what we call Romeo recruitment. I'm the answer to your every dream. I love you. You're so special. Only I can see how special you are. I will love you forever. I will protect you, and I'm just nuts about you. And the kids fall for it. They feel at the first protected and loved and cared about, and they don't know that it's all a scam. All right, so what does all of this mean? When we bring it all together, what I hope to get across is that every one of these forms of violence is interconnected. Most importantly, there's no such thing as less harmful or more important violence. And that is hard to wrap our heads around. It's very difficult, but violence is our enemy. The viewpoint that there is some that's less harmful and some that's more important has prevented us from healing as communities, and it completely ignores the fact that many of us are poly victims, have been victimized and traumatized by many kinds of violence, and trying to do one at a time or single one out is not helpful for healing. And so my pitch is we have to respond to violence itself, violence in all forms, as an illness, a Wendigo, that has infected our communities. Not bad people, but an illness. And yeah, I do believe there are bad people, but the issue is within our communities, if we want capable guardianship for our children, we have to heal at the community level, not at the individual victim level. It's isolating to do that. The things that we know is that when we put healing first, we regain some very important things that are part of every Native culture I've ever known, a respect for ourselves and others, accepting personal responsibility without shame or blame, being our best selves, and doing that for the good of our community because we care about our community as we care about ourselves. But it's also holding others accountable in ways that affirm their value to the community. We have a mom who has had her kids removed because she abuses substances, and the kids have been neglected or have been exposed to sexual violence by her boyfriend. Do we punish that mom, or do we hold her accountable in a way that affirms that she's valuable to us, to our community, to her children? And do we try to help her heal? We also regain an environment where children learn positive life skills by watching the adults in their lives. They have models to look to. They see adults accepting personal responsibility, holding each other accountable in good ways. And kids learn best when they see it that way instead of a teaching method like they have to change to make things better. So there are challenges to this. I know I sound like I'm Pollyanna. I've got this glorious idea and there's no way to do it, but we do have challenges. The federal funding streams that exist right now force tribes to separate services for different kinds of violence. And the tribes don't have other options to fund those services. Most of them are law enforcement focused. They don't allow community-level healing as the main priority, and as it stands now, tribes still cannot prosecute non-native perpetrators for crimes other than domestic violence. So we cannot stop the boyfriend that sexually abuses children as tribal governments. We have to rely on the federal government to consider it a good enough case to take it, or the state government. So these are big challenges. This just came out in an interview, the Pine Ridge's district attorney. First of all, the last study in 2014, 70% of adults on Pine Ridge were unemployed, and they have one of the highest rates of child abuse and neglect in the United States. But here's the problem. The tribal DA just reported this. There is no funding available for behavioral health services for physically and sexually abused children. There's nothing offering them, nothing offered to them to help them heal that is programmatic, that is part of tribal services. And the Pine Ridge's federal applications for public safety and child protection funding, they were all rejected 2 years in a row. So you've got a community with very high rates of problems that stem from and are related to child abuse and neglect, and no way to address them. No way other than pulling out of the community. All right. I do want to mention some steps in the right direction. There is a new focus on mindfulness, body-mind medicine. Bonnie Duran is doing this at the University of Washington and doing some really excellent work. She's in the School of Social Work there. At the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, Patina Park is the executive director. Linda Eagle Speaker is a certified trainer in mind-body medicine. And they're doing this work in Oshkoshkee and Healing Journey programs, and it's making a huge difference with the women and the kids to find ways to ground themselves, to find themselves and heal together. It's having really great impacts. Other steps in the right direction are incorporating tribal customs and spiritual ceremonies into substance abuse treatment. That could be brought into many other kinds of assistance, especially working with abused and neglected kids. There are some programs that do in-home services in cases of child neglect, where parents are offered mentoring and coaching in parenting and life skills by somebody more of a peer than somebody who is an enforcer. I'm sure there are many others, and it would be great to hear from them, that the things that are already doing to emphasize that healing at the community level. So, questions and comments. I've lost track of my time, so I'm not sure where we are with that.
Okay. Hi, Sandi. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was about 45 minutes, so you're doing well. So if we can open up for questions that people may have.
Okay, I'm reading one of them. May have mentioned in the preamble, but will the PowerPoint be available to download later? Good, you said yes.
Yes.
It'll be available in a PDF, but not as a slideshow. There we go. Victim selection. Can everybody see this chat stuff?
I believe they can.
Okay. Victim selection is interesting. Yep. Grew up as an easy target. Cool. Yeah, we don't often realize that perpetrators really do look for certain things. And if we want to protect our kids, we need to eliminate as many of those things as we can. And usually we think of, well, let's teach the kid to protect themselves. Well, that's all well and good. But capable guardianship is our responsibility. And one of the difficulties I know in my own family and community, and probably others that I've heard of, we do have this mind your own business, no talk rule. But, you know, I challenge us all to think of whether that, in the negative sense, was a product of boarding schools. Because in boarding schools, kids were punished for taking care of each other, for sticking up for each other, for even talking. Kids and siblings were not allowed to talk to each other. So that was broken down, and the bad thing about that was sometimes if a child was being victimized and somebody came to their defense, not only was the person that came to their defense punished, but the kid who was victimized got it double. So we could actually make it worse. I would say capable guardianship means we need to be nosy. If we see a kid or a person who is at risk, coming together to offer some kind of help is an obligation. Yes, it can be dangerous, especially when there are gangs that are doing the violence. But as communities, we have to find a way to not let people just be victimized and nobody says a thing. All right, that's my pitch on that one. Let's see.
There's the next question. It says, I'll let you read it.
Will it be emailed to us is the one I saw.
Yep, well, I responded to that. Yes, the link to our website will be emailed to, it has been emailed to you. You just go to our website and you can download the webinar presentation. And so the next question starts with, why do you think?
I don't see another one.
Okay, scroll. If you go to that box and use.
I'm scrolling down.
Okay. Well,
I have an answer. It's often our life experiences that lead us to chosen professions. I'm glad you've chosen to educate and train others. But I don't see another question.
Okay, I'll read it to you.
Oh, good.
Okay. Why do you think that there does not appear to be a response of indignation that one would expect to see if this type of data was prevalent in other groups of cultural or ethnic groups?
I think that we have a tremendously traumatized people. And I think that many of us, our leaders and others, either, I'll speak for myself. I'll speak only for myself, so I'm not pointing fingers. With my youngest son, I hit him when he wouldn't behave because I had adopted that belief that when you're at your wit's end and the kid won't listen, you hit them, then they pay attention. I fell into it, even with everything I knew. I was 37 when he was born. I had gotten away from the pimp. I had rebuilt a life. I'd done a lot of my healing, and I still did that. Gratefully, it felt bad, and I started talking. I told people. And that is the hardest thing to do. If you have shame over something you've done, the usual response is to not tell anybody. Especially if you're in a community where if you tell anybody, you will be attacked. So I think many of I know the urban Indian communities, and I think many tribal communities, to take that kind of risk, we'll do it with substance abuse. We'll say, I was a drunk, I abandoned my children, I beat my wife when I was drunk, that sort of thing. But we don't say, I did things that harmed my children because I was messed up. We don't easily say, women say, well, I left for 3 days and my kids had to figure out how to feed themselves. We need an environment where a woman can say that and she gets a response that says, wow, what do you think pushed that? That must have been really hard. So what was going on in your head at the time? And begin a healing process. The mindfulness I'm talking about asks you to check in, asks you to think about that. But I think many of our leaders just don't have that confidence, or perhaps they're just too afraid to acknowledge that they have done bad things, don't want to speak out because they know that other people know they've done bad things, and they don't want to sustain any more harm to themselves. That's my thinking. It's very, very difficult to tell your worst secrets and know that people might attack you. And my guess is that's why we don't see the kind of response. These numbers are terrifying. It is my belief that we have a lot of damage being done within our communities by our own people and by people who protect those that are doing damage. But we also have tremendous damage by non-natives who have no constraints on their behavior, none at all. Tribes can't prosecute a non-native for rape. They can't prosecute a non-native for sexually abusing one of their children. That has to be done by a larger government entity. And if that entity doesn't want to pick up the case, what happens to that victim? What happens to the community? I don't know if I answered you. I hope so.
We have more questions here. So the next one is, just curious, are kids more vulnerable from Native communities who border major cities or rural areas?
Are kids more vulnerable in Native communities or what?
Who border major cities or are in rural areas?
I think generational trauma takes no prisoners, or takes all prisoners. I think that makes our kids vulnerable everywhere, and it depends on who's in the community. In a rural area, there was a time when I was a kid when we lived on 32 acres in Florida, and we had a patch of sweetgrass. I didn't know it was sweetgrass until I came to the Midwest and smelled a sweetgrass braid, but I found it, and I would go out there and lay in it for hours. And because it made me feel better. We're instinctively drawn. So that was a very healing place for me. There was still all kinds of crap going on in my family. My father was still a child molester. His mother was still tremendously verbally abusive, and she lived with us. But I had a way. There was some place to go. So I would say nature, in some ways, was very healing for me, and I've heard other survivors talk about that. Urban areas very often have programs that you can go to. There is no Oshkoshnikikwe on reservations. There's nowhere for the kids to go to just hang out, drop in, get taught about healthy sexuality, get taught about what you have a right to expect from a boyfriend or girlfriend. They don't learn that. There's nowhere to learn that. There's nowhere to share and get input from your peers about, well, what do I do about that? We don't have that capacity. And one of the reasons is the funding streams. Now, in the urban area, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center relies on foundations, private foundation dollars. They do get some state funding, but it's not much. So they have to really rely on what they can bring in from people who want to help the poor kids in the urban area. So, you know, it's more complex than that. It's what are the resources? What's the community like? Is there a place where people can go that's safe and begin their healing process? And is it accessible? I know that there are people who do ceremonies with the kids within their circles, within their family connections. But we have thousands of kids who don't have that and don't have access. They have no way to get there.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, has the intake screening been utilized in other DV organizations?
Not the one we developed, and I'll tell you, it took 10 years, and only for the past 4 years have the advocates been fans of doing this. It's very easy when you're a direct service provider to say, this paperwork is bullshit. It's getting in the way of me working with this person. She has so many problems to solve. She needs housing. She needs food. She needs this. She needs that. And here I am filling out this stupid form. What they have learned over time is that I give them back the report. I sit with the staff. I explain, and they have developed their programs in response to what they do. But, you know, a lot don't have money for evaluation. And a lot don't have an evaluator who's used to working within this community and who is a survivor too. So I've been with them more than 10 years, and we built it from the ground up. And now they have been very generous about sharing their assessment tool with others. So, let me go to my next slide. I lost it. I'm going to the next slide because I've got contact. Oh, gee. Okay. I'm going to have to try to, I don't know what happened here. It kicked me out.
There you go.
There. Okay. It's on, there you go. Okay. This is contact information. If you were interested in their screening tool, it is a 2-hour interview. But by the time you finished it, you've built a relationship with the person sitting there. You have a very clear sense of what's needed for case management, and it has to be done in a really good way. And they need to understand that, I mean, your client has to understand that you're not there just taking from them. It's to help make you safe and help you plan. And we do it every 6 months. We go back at the end of 6 months and say, okay, 52%, or usually it's 80% of the women have more safe or more stable housing. And it's because of the program. They have reduced their exposure to violence. They're not getting in physical fights as much as they did. Or they have ended the relationship with a chemically dependent partner. So we can track that, and we can look at those changes. And they can also then, as they're doing that follow-up interview, say, wow, you improved in that. So it's a way of feeding back to your participant that they're doing good things with their lives. But finding the enthusiasm and the commitment to do that work feels really strange when you've got somebody who is emotionally bleeding in front of you. There's a good way to do it. If you're interested, I don't think any organization that I know of is doing the same kind of comprehensive intake that NIWRC's programs are. So their contact information is on the slide, and I would encourage you to get in touch with them because, like I said, they've been really generous about sharing how they do it, sharing their program model, and encouraging others to try to do it too.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, has the topic of parenting skills were lost during the boarding school days as the children were forcibly removed from parents and institutionalized? Therefore, parenting was not given to the children after their removal? Has this topic been, parenting skills?
I lost it. I didn't quite get that. I'm
Okay,
trying to find it on the screen too. Oh, I got the response of indignation. Okay. So let me see. There's an I found out how to do this.
Okay, so
No,
it's down.
that's not that one. No, it just doesn't want to give it to me. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's see if there's another one above it. Nope, this is the response and indignation. Let me see if it's down there. We're all looking at screens, you know, trying to make it work. Try reading it to me again, Lisa.
Okay, I will. It says, has the topic of parenting skills that were lost during the boarding school days as the children were forcibly removed from parents and were institutionalized, therefore, parenting skills was not given to the children after their removal?
Right. No, they didn't learn parenting skills. They learned violence as a problem solver. They learned to reject all of the positive things about their cultures as inferior, as disgusting, as foolish. They were taught that to survive well, first of all, they were taught that they should never want to go home. There is a person, my family, 3 generations of us went to Carlisle boarding school, and there's a woman there who has transcribed the newsletters from that boarding school. The school matron, a white woman, wrote everything, and it was propaganda. But it was the kids' only source of news about who went back home, who got married, who was sick. That's the important things to them. But in there were all these messages about how horribly inferior their families and their traditions were, and that especially the girls had to guard against going back to the blanket. And it's throughout all the newsletters that they were indoctrinated to have contempt. So they get back and they see parents who let their children learn painful lessons on their own, which my mom used to tie me to the dog and turn me loose out in acres of land. She figured if anybody was going to hurt me, the dog would handle it. I was free. I'll tell you, that was a good thing, because I learned that you don't climb certain trees because then you fall. I learned all kinds of things. I learned you can fall in the water and the dog has to drag you out. Those were lessons that I learned on my own, and some would call it neglect. I don't think so. She was watching, and our neighbors were watching, and they were giving me room to make mistakes that didn't kill me. Our kids were given so much freedom. I know I'm Seneca, I'm Iroquois, but you hear these stories in other communities about kids given room to learn through experience. Parenting wasn't controlling your children. That's not what it was about. And the parenting was not just a parent's, the birth parent's responsibility. It was everybody's responsibility, that we all took care of the kids. And I know we lived in a very small community in Indiana that was a lot of Native people, and that's the one where Mom would turn me loose, but I would go visit. I'd go to people's houses, and I remember a man sharpening a scythe, with the wheel, with the foot pedal. He put me on the foot pedal. I'm 3, right? And I'm supposed to pump this pedal. And he had me sit on the ground and push on it. He was teaching me to work with him. I would go somewhere else, and one of the women would be canning. She put me to work with a knife. But she watched me. And so I had for 3 years of my life, I had a circle that was really, really good for me. And when I was trying to do my healing from all the poly-victimization, I went back to that and remembered what it felt like. And I think we need to look carefully at what parenting, how our parenting, whatever our tribe was, whatever our culture was, how was it different from the parenting that we look at today? And is it really about controlling your children, monitoring, in not a good sense, in not trusting our children?
Thank you. You draw a strong parallel about what were our cultural teachings on parenting and how do we reconnect with that. Because knowing that we have a lot of grandparents, great-grandparents, and even great-great-grandparents that are raising the grandchildren, just because of the disconnect of what the boarding school era did. I think that was one of the most detrimental impacts to our societies that interrupted so much. And
it was.
Yeah, and so the more importance of relearning our cultural roots of who we are and our teachings and everything else, and restoring that is key to healing and just that restoration of changing the outcomes of what we're facing. We have another question. It says, this is public knowledge, and yet there is such a lack of response from the United States government. Your data on the lack of response to requests for help goes unheard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of my biggest outrages is, the Canadian government apologized to its boarding school survivors and put money into it, millions of dollars, to make it right. It was a clear and absolute apology. Now, that's not to say everything's perfect in Canada, but the U.S. government, President Obama actually did do an apology. Did you ever see it in public? It was never announced. It was buried in a military bill in Congress. And in it, it said, I'm paraphrasing, we do not accept liability for this. So it was a sort of an apology buried in a congressional bill, never a public announcement. And it said, but don't look to me to make it right. Our country is really messed up. The U.S. is really messed up in how it responds to Native people. And honestly, okay, you got me on my rant. My rant is our blood quantums are dropping in every tribal community. I swear to God, I think the U.S. government is going to start terminating tribes again. I really do. I'm a sociologist by training, and it's just a setup. And tribes are having to strategize. I know here in Minnesota, some of the Ojibwe tribes are working on having an aggregate blood quantum. If you have heritage from several of the Ojibwe tribes, looking at it in the aggregate. But we have so much intermarriage across our tribal communities, and I think it's going to be very difficult for our kids. I really do. And I don't know how tribes with excellent treaties have a better chance than anybody else. But even then, it's whatever was specified in the treaty. But no, this country is not responsive to our tribal communities at all.
Yeah, I agree in regards to the lack of response from the U.S., but I think, when the Trafficking and Victims Act passed in 2000, it wasn't until actually in the last couple of years that the United States actually began to respond to the human trafficking, domestically. They've always addressed to the international trafficking that was occurring, but domestically they were at the same same point as tribes. Usually, by the time the United States is responding to something, we're always, unfortunately, an afterthought, or we're an add-on to a sentence that does more damage than good. And then years later, and yes, we forgot the Indians. Let's go back and try to address that. So I think for the first time, we're kind of on a parallel standing with the U.S. in the response to sex trafficking occurring, because in our communities, a lot of people don't believe that's even happening here. Whether you're Native or non-Native, whether you're professional or not, you have a lot of people that don't believe that it's happening in rural, remote, communities. And they think it's a major, major city issue, and it's not. It's always been here, and that's the realization. And with sex trafficking, it's not like an added layer of, oh my God, now we have more to respond to. It's just a matter of widening our perceptions and our view of understanding that it's always been here, it's been prevalent, we've been responding to it, just not being able to really truly recognize and identify what it is. It's always been.
And VAWA dollars, I don't know if it's changed recently, but VAWA dollars were not allowed to be used for sex trafficking victims. It was only domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Well, all three of those things are part of sex trafficking.
Yes, and there's an exception to VAWA of 2013 under our tribal Title IX called Safety for Indian Women that is only in this this piece of the VAWA language that tribal coalitions can help tribal nations respond to sex trafficking. So it can help with code development, help with other types of infrastructures that may occur, trainings. There's specific language specific to tribal coalitions within VAWA, but the rest of the bill doesn't apply. So that was one thing that we were able to get through. So there are tribal coalitions in your state. You can go to our www.niwrc.org website and click on the tribal coalitions, and it'll list the tribal coalitions in the states that they're in. So if you have questions or thoughts, you can also contact them. That they could possibly help assist. Okay, we have another comment. It says, but there are such dangers for children today. Above the environmental dangers, which may be the same. Oops. There is
my dog.
Okay.
I don't know who's at my door, but hopefully he'll stop in a minute.
Okay.
Now tell me again, Lisa.
Okay. But there are such dangers for children today. Above the environmental dangers, which may be the same, there are more violence, more weapons, more sexual abuse, violent video games and TV, movies, and shows. So many people under the influence of alcohol and drugs. It seems more dangerous to allow children to make their own way and be places where their parents don't even know where they are. It seems that although control of kids is not the native way, there needs to be more monitoring by parents and restrictions of children's being in unsafe places.
Yeah, it is. It's not a safe world. The monitoring, the kids that I see at NIWRC, they're on their own. Nobody's really paying attention to where they are or what they're doing. There's monitoring and there's controlling. And monitoring is making sure the kid's safe and letting them know that you care about them. So yeah, we do need that. And honestly, I was doing a study on domestic violence with 4 of the reservations years ago, and somebody asked me, well, how would you end violence in our communities? And I said, throw away your televisions. That did not get a good response, but I was serious. My youngest son had no television. When he was about 5, I got rid of it. I mean, we have a TV, we watch movies, but at least I had some control over that. But yeah, regular TV, no. It's just, it's very violent. It normalizes sex as a way to get something you want. It violates the sacred in so many ways. And I know it's a big step, but it is absolutely. I mean, right now, kids, one of my neighbors said that her 13-year-old granddaughter got a cell phone. I said, she's not allowed to lock it, and her parents need to check it on a daily basis. And she told me that the dad stepped in and he checks his daughter's cell phone every single day. He looks at her texts, and if she's erased everything, she loses the phone. So they've had to do that because she's not safe. And I know Sergeant Grant Snyder, who heads the sex trafficking unit here in Minneapolis, he's an amazing officer. I absolutely love Grant Snyder. But in the past few months, his daughter finally came out that her family had been struggling with it. She had fallen for a guy in her school who was slightly older, and he talked her into sending, I think it's a photo of her in a bra. And he used that to try to threaten and coerce her. And humiliated her in her school, made her life hell. And she did finally tell her parents. But Grant said, my God, I do this work. We have raised her to know that this is bad stuff. And she still fell for it because the guy, he's high school, cute guy, came across as, oh, you know, I'm really interested in you, and she fell for it. So, you know, he said no kid is safe, but yes, we do have to monitor. We do need definitely look at their cell phones. We do need to look at their Facebook constantly. And then you can have a discussion about, oh, honey, do you realize what you just did? What did you know that was not safe? But I know NIWRC, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, is doing online safety with the kids. And it's making a difference. A lot of them just didn't realize all the things that could be done and the risks they were incurring with stuff they put online.
Thank you. We have another question. It says, have you found any tribal laws that are specific to sex trafficking on the reservations? There are tribal codes. If you look on our NIWRC website, I do believe we did put some of the tribal codes. Wait, no, that's stalking codes. I take that back. I know that the wider tribal nation is working on.
Right, that's what I saw.
Code. Yeah, working on a
Brunner announced that they were working on a tribal code, but I don't think anybody has one. And
I don't think so either.
I mean, and really, it's a problem again with the federal government because cities. I mean, Minneapolis may prosecute a case of sex trafficking, but it's usually a single pimp operation, or maybe at the most two. But if it's a ring, if it's a big operation, they turn it over to the state or the feds because they want the major penalties. So Indian communities are kind of stuck, reservation communities are kind of stuck because getting the feds to pick one up is not easy. They want a rock solid case. I know North Dakota is getting a lot of attention because of the fracking fields, and the crime just went off the chart in that area. Fort Berthold is really up against it. They've been aware and trying to address sex trafficking of their kids for, at least 5 years. And it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, definitely. And I would ask anybody, if you are within administration or if you begin to work on tribal laws and codes, to really look at holding sex buyers accountable, because the reality is that if the sex buyers are the ones that are creating the demand, and the sex traffickers are there to fill that demand, which makes it the second or third largest multi-billion-dollar industry in the world. So the tribes really could take this a step far beyond the United States ever could, or in some states, to really start holding sex buyers accountable and charging them.
But they can only hold Indian sex buyers accountable. And that's
a start. Yep, that's a start that the tribes can start holding.
But I would
holding the offenders. Yeah,
I would be looking at tribal and state cooperation, and tribes pushing the states to prosecute sex buyers that they identify on the reservation. I absolutely would, because there have to be, Lisa's absolutely right, we have to kill demand. And you kill demand by making it, remember I said perpetrators pick their victims because for the lowest possible risk to themselves? Well, increase the risk. Make the penalties greater. And we also, in our communities, we need to combat this idea, oh, men will be men. Our men did not do this stuff. This is not part of our cultures. So, that has to be confronted.
I'll put it in the answer box. A good piece to look at is called a NIRC model, and you can
Yes.
Google that, and it'll lay out how effective that particular model has been. But just to, our tribes really have the right and the ability to exercise their sovereign authority, and by holding sex buyers accountable I think is really key to really stemming this issue within our tribal communities. I know that our tribes only have kernel jurisdiction over Indians, and then under Violence Against Women Act of 2013, we're limited to domestic violence, stalking, and violations of order for protections. But our tribes really need to start taking an aggressive stand, if they can, to really start holding them, both the trafficker and the buyers, accountable for this. Put their names in the paper. Public humiliation goes a long way, so there are many different things that can be done. We have another question here.
Okay.
Okay. It says, in my experience with sex trafficking and cases, the perpetrators were the older males in the communities, and I successfully put together 2 cases, and one just pled guilty. Congratulations. I have had young people approach to go to the Bakken, but none had left the area. So it isn't always a pimp or someone from other areas. True.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
very true. Because, a lot of people have this idea that pimps or sex traffickers are black guys, and they're from major cities, or the gangbangers, or whatever it may be. But the ones that are trafficking can also be grandpa, dad, brother, uncle, cousins, grandma, mom, sisters. So
Yes.
it can be our own family members that are doing that. So thank you for raising such an important point.
Well, one of the things we also need to be aware of, I didn't do a sex trafficking presentation, but in Minneapolis, we do have those pimps from outside, mostly African American, often gang affiliated, but they are recruiting our young men, offering them a lot of money to be part of the operation and go in and recruit the girls in their communities. And we're seeing that again and again and again. There was one case that a 14-year-old Native boy was picked up, and he was pimping 13-year-old girls. But he was working for somebody. He was working at 2 levels. There were 2 levels of pimps above him. So they had boys in other communities who were going out and bringing in the girls from their communities. So it's not just our girls who are in danger, and we also, our transgender boys are being targeted for sex trafficking. But the most of our boys are being grabbed and trained to be pimps and told that this is the way you make some money quick.
Yes, thank you. We have another question. It says, in regards to holding sex buyers accountable, have there been any work at posting on Backpage and Craigslist with ads or memes against sex trafficking or for the awareness of sex trafficking?
It seems to me, well, I know that there are posts on Backpage that if you are being trafficked, you can get help here. So they post knowing that the trafficked girls may be looking at ads. So they have you can get help here kinds of ads. But if somebody's on Backpage trying to find a girl, they're not going to read ads that are not about girls. That's not their interest area. But I think that there could be some kind of advertising campaign to post ads, like if a sex buyer was busted, put something on Backpage for that.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Like Lisa was talking about embarrassing public humiliation, post them on Backpage. And now I don't know if there are legal issues about that, but I think if there's a conviction, it's public.
We have another comment. It says they call them their boyfriends and would look for runaways in the area.
Yes.
Absolutely.
They do call them their boyfriends. And actually, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center does not use the term pimp. They call them bad boyfriends. And that way the girls can hear it. That's a bad boyfriend. And so they do. They teach them, this is what if somebody wants you to do this, this, and this, you have, that's not right. This is what you have the right to expect from somebody who says he loves you. And so they do that kind of education. Or they'll do a scenario and, really, anybody interested, I would really encourage you to talk with Linda, Eagle Speaker at Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, because they've been developing this program for I guess 6 years now I've been doing it, but they are really they now have a mental health unit that is doing, these girls would never go to therapy, never, would not, no interest whatsoever. They're seeing the therapist. So, they're reframing things in a healing way. And the Healing Journey ladies asked for group therapy, so they meet with the therapist. And so they're taking these Western models, mainstream models, but they're bringing them into Native tradition and Native culture and making them work that way. So they may be a strategy, but they're being filtered through culture. And it really is doing some good stuff.
Absolutely, and thank you for that comment, because it is important to understand that they don't identify the traffickers as pimps, that they definitely identify them as boyfriends, and with runaways, and I do believe, according to your research, Sandi, isn't it within 48 hours a runaway is being sold on a corner?
That's somebody. I don't think there's any. I'll talk as a researcher. I don't think there's any concrete data to prove that's true.
Okay.
But I will say that if you go downtown Minneapolis, you will see men in cars cruising the bus station, cruising the library, cruising the places where the kids will probably be. And so they're looking for kids. So runaway and homeless kids are going to be downtown St. Paul or downtown Minneapolis, because they're looking to find some place to spend the night or some place to go. That's where the runaway and homeless youth hang out. There are certain places. And so they go to those places to try to make a connection just for that day, or they're going to meet somebody there. And the sex buyers go hunting them. They go hunting them as they walk to and from school. They go hunting them outside youth centers. They really go looking for them.
Thank you for that terminology. I appreciate it, because it's very very prevalent. That our vulnerable youth are being hunted by predators. Definitely by predators. There was a comment that was attached to the other ones in regards to the Bakken oil boom comments, and or one that was trying to sway the youth from her community was from a local Native gang. And there's definitely gang activities all over. We have the Native mob. There's just so many different types of gangs, and they're definitely part of that process as well of the trafficking. So that they have their role that they play in the playing in society when it comes to violence against our youth. Okay.
Yeah,
well, we're coming up on our 3:30 mark, so I don't see any more questions. And did you have any final words you want to say, Sandi?
No, but if anybody would like to talk further, my email address is on that last screen. Please feel free to holler. And I wish you all the best. Thanks for coming in on this. You asked great questions, and it's been a very interesting conversation.
Yes, thank you. So, so to close this out, you have received an evaluation. If you could just please take a few minutes to fill that evaluation form out, that will be sent to you. We're very grateful for that. It just helps us, just so that we're doing our job better and where we can make improvements, or if this was effective and helpful. So I want to thank you to the participants for your time today and for the wonderful dialogue. And thank you, Sandi, for sharing your story and your time and just the wealth of knowledge that you have to help all tribal communities and all people across the country.
Yeah,